Albert Big Ross ran a cocaine pipeline out of Stone Mountain, Georgia, importing about 2,000 kilograms from Mexico through a CJNG-linked supplier and storing a single 300 kilogram load at an elderly family member's home that media reports later valued at roughly $4.5 million. The operation moved product through Texas into Atlanta and Athens for years before federal agents traced the cash, the texts, and the trips back to him. This is the story of how Albert Big Ross turned his grandma's house into a $4.5 million cocaine warehouse. Stone Mountain sits 16 miles northeast of downtown Atlanta. It is a Georgia suburb where homeowners cut their lawns on Saturday mornings and complain about HOA fees. That is the address Albert Ross listed as home for years while running one of the largest cocaine pipelines federal investigators in the Middle District of Georgia have ever taken down. Ross was 53 years old at the time of his sentencing, and he had a prior felony drug conviction in Fulton County Superior Court, along with numerous prior felony arrests for drug trafficking. His mugshot in the system dates to June 2005, almost 2 decades before the federal case that ended his career, 2 decades of arrests that did not stick, 2 decades of convictions that did not slow him down. By the time investigators began building the file that would close the book on him, Ross had already spent years studying every gap in the system and learning how to move through it. They called him Big because of the size of the cocaine shipments he was moving. Federal prosecutors say Ross was the leader of a large-scale drug trafficking organization responsible for importing approximately 2,000 kilograms of cocaine into the United States from Mexico for distribution in Georgia. On paper, his life read as ordinary: a Stone Mountain home, a bar in the Atlanta area that he owned, a family and neighborhood, the kind of profile that does not draw attention. Behind that profile, Ross was running a pipeline that stretched from Mexico through Texas and into Georgia, with cash flowing back along the same route. The cocaine came from a source in Mexico affiliated with the Cartel de Jalisco Nueva Generación, the CJNG. Couriers moved bulk loads from Texas to Atlanta destinations under his direction. Money for the cocaine purchases was given to couriers in Atlanta, who then carried it to Ross's supplier in Mexico. When the cocaine arrived in the Atlanta area, Ross had to put it somewhere. The choice he made is the detail that defines the case. Court records state that Ross stashed the dope at an elderly family member's home who had previously been shot picking up drug proceeds at Ross's direction. Read that sentence again. The relative had already been shot once on Ross's behalf, once for picking up drug money, and after that, Ross was still using the same person's home as the storage point for the cocaine. Filings do not name this elderly relative. Public records describe only an elderly family member. Some media accounts later called the location a grandmother's house, but the official documents stop at elderly. No charges, no press release, no public identification. A senior member of Ross's family was used as a warehouse, and the only mark of their role in the case is a single line in court filings. The numbers tied to that house alone explain why the nickname was accurate. In a 3-month period in 2018, Ross's organization received 1,300 kilograms of cocaine from a Mexican supplier, and that load was stashed at the elderly family member's home. Prosecutors emphasized the weight rather than a dollar figure. Media accounts later cited approximate street values around $4.5 million for that 1,300 kilogram stash. Either way, the home in question held one of the largest cocaine caches connected to a single trafficker in the region. Ross was running a second supply chain at the same time. The CJNG-linked source was one channel. The 2018 supplier was another. Ross was hedging his inventory, treating bulk cocaine the way a commodity trader treats a position. If the 1,300 kilogram load shows the size of his stash, the spring of 2020 shows the speed of his pipeline. Text messages on Ross's seized iPhone documented that between March 14 and April 4, 2020, Ross was supplied with 112 kilograms of cocaine. During the same 22-day period, Ross sent more than $2.5 million in payment to his cocaine source in Mexico. 22 days, 112 kilograms in, $2.5 million out, from a single phone in his own messages. The math at that pace projects to several tons of cocaine per year and tens of millions in payments to Mexico. Investigators were not estimating from interviews or guessing from intercepted shipments. The proof was sitting on Ross's own device. The Stone Mountain house was the operational center. The elderly relative's home was the warehouse. There was also a bar in the Atlanta area that Ross owned, presented to the public as a small private business. When agents searched the bar alongside Ross's home, they seized over $600,000 in drug proceeds from inside. The bar's name was never put into a public release. That is how a front business is supposed to function. The investigation that exposed all of this was led by the FBI's Athens resident agency, which ran a long-term operation focused on Ross's cocaine distribution activities. FBI agents worked alongside the DEA, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, the Athens Clark County Police, the Georgia State Patrol, and more than a dozen other state and local agencies. Their tools included wiretaps, physical surveillance, vehicle trackers, and confidential informants. That architecture of investigation does not assemble around a small operation. The scale of the response is itself a measure of the scale of the target. By the time agents arrived at Ross's Stone Mountain home on September 23, 2021, the work in the background was years deep. Inside Ross's bedroom closet, agents found more than $300,000 in cash wrapped in tinfoil and vacuum sealed in black trash bags. Six-figure stacks in the closet of a suburban home. The same man who had flown to Mexico City to negotiate with cartel leadership had been keeping his cash in the closet. The Stone Mountain arrest was one stop on a wider day of action. The bar in Atlanta produced more than $600,000 in additional proceeds. Across the entire investigation, law enforcement seized $3,864,210 in cash, 73 firearms, 165.22 kilograms of cocaine, 1.32 kilograms of fentanyl, 11.25 ounces of heroin, 1.39 kilograms of crack cocaine, 12.57 pounds of crystal methamphetamine, 25.35 pounds of marijuana, and 198 dosage units of controlled pharmaceuticals. That is the inventory of one man's network: cocaine, fentanyl, heroin, crack, methamphetamine, marijuana, pills, and dozens of guns. Each line on the list represents a supply chain, customers, and communities. U.S. Attorney Peter D. Leary, at the plea hearing, said Ross had directed enormous amounts of deadly drugs into Georgia from Mexico for many years. The phrase that filings keep returning to is many years, not a season, not a single run, a career. And the spine of that career, on the storage side, was the home of an elderly family member who had already been wounded once on Ross's behalf and who never appeared in any indictment. That is the foundation. A suburban resident with a record going back to 2005, a CJNG-linked supplier in Mexico, a 300-kilogram load at a relative's house, a 22-day phone log showing 112 kilograms and $2.5 million, a bar with $600,000 in cash inside, a closet stuffed with tinfoil-wrapped bricks of bills, and a federal investigation pulling on every thread. To understand how the elderly relative's home held the value it did, the next layer is the Mexican side of the operation. The cartel relationship is what fed the pipeline, and in August 2019, Ross flew to Mexico City to take that relationship in person. The cartel connection, Mexico City, and the CJNG. The connection that fed the elderly relative's house began thousands of miles south, inside one of the most heavily armed criminal organizations in the Western Hemisphere. To understand how 1,300 kilograms of cocaine ended up parked at a senior family member's home in suburban Georgia, the trail has to start in Mexico, where the source of supply was attached to the most aggressive cartel currently operating across the United States. According to court filings, Ross's drug trafficking organization was supplied cocaine by a source in Mexico affiliated with the Cartel de Jalisco Nueva Generación, known by its initials, CJNG, affiliated, not partnered, not employed. The supplier sat under the broader umbrella of the cartel, which means every kilogram Ross moved was tethered to one of the most dangerous organizations on the continent. The CJNG, by 2020, had been formally identified by U.S. officials as the single biggest criminal drug threat facing the country. Federal investigators have repeatedly described the cartel's structure not as a street gang, but as a corporate machine, with a board, financial officers, regional managers, and franchise-style territorial expansion across multiple Mexican states. They are the kind of organization that does not bother with low-volume operators. To get a meeting with their leadership, you need weight, money, and a reputation for moving product without losing it. By 2019, Ross had built all three because his pipeline through Texas had been running steadily enough that the Mexican side of the chain was willing to look him in the face. Agents learned that Ross and co-conspirators flew to Mexico City in August 2019 to meet with Ross's CJNG cocaine supplier and his cartel boss to negotiate a deal where they would supply Ross's organization with 200 additional kilograms of cocaine per month. Sit with that picture for a second. A man from Stone Mountain, Georgia, boarding an international flight, walking into a meeting room in Mexico City, and sitting across the table from a CJNG supplier and that supplier's boss. He went there as a counterparty negotiating monthly volume. The conversation in that room was over a 200 kilogram per month resupply arrangement, on top of whatever existing flows were already in motion. 200 kilos a month, 2,400 kilos a year if the agreement ran clean. That single meeting is the moment Ross stopped being a regional trafficker and stepped into the international category. The supplier in Mexico was not pulling in some neighborhood dealer for a sit-down. They were pulling in a partner whose Atlanta area network could absorb that kind of monthly tonnage and cycle the cash back fast enough to keep the pipeline lubricated. Years later, in February 2025, the United States Department of State formally designated the CJNG a foreign terrorist organization. By the time that label landed on paper, Ross was already serving life in federal prison. But the timeline matters. The boss across the table from Ross in Mexico City was, in the eventual U.S. classification, a leader of a designated terrorist organization. That is the relationship that fed the suburban Georgia warehouse. The volume Ross moved with that connection was staggering. The 22-day burst in March and April of 2020, at 112 kilos in, $2.5 million out, was not an outlier. It was the rhythm of the pipeline at full speed. Investigators also documented that during a 3-month stretch in 2018, Ross's organization received 3,300 kilograms of cocaine from a different Mexican supplier, running parallel to the CJNG-linked stream. 2 suppliers, 2 streams, 2 redundant routes designed so that no single seizure or arrest could shut the operation down. The mechanics of the pipeline were almost industrial. Working with co-conspirators, investigators discovered that Ross directed individuals to transport large quantities of cocaine from Texas to be distributed to Ross's customers and associates. Money for the cocaine purchases was given to couriers in Atlanta, who would then deliver the money to Ross's cocaine supplier in Mexico. That is the loop. Cocaine moves north out of Mexico, crosses through Texas, runs east on the interstate corridors, and surfaces in the Atlanta metro. Cash collected from sales moves the other way. Atlanta couriers carrying duffel-grade quantities of bills back to Mexico to pay the supplier. Every cycle requires synchronization. Every cycle requires trust. Every cycle requires that nobody in the chain panics when something goes wrong. The cocaine itself was rarely transported in obvious vehicles. The biggest documented seizure tied to Ross involved a tractor trailer with a false wall that concealed 152 kilograms of cocaine on Interstate 20, which is a level of concealment that requires custom fabrication, money, and dedicated mechanics. The cash side of the loop was even more sophisticated. By December 2018, Ross had moved into private aviation, using a small aircraft out of Peachtree DeKalb Airport to ferry millions of dollars in drug proceeds from Atlanta to California, where the funds could continue west toward the Mexican border. Atlanta itself was not picked at random. Federal officials in Georgia have long described the city as a transshipment hub for the Mexican cartels, distributing drugs across the East Coast and routing money back south. The interstates that converge on the city, I-20, I-85, I-75, make it one of the easiest places in the country to disperse a load. The world's busiest passenger airport sits inside the metro area. Add a network of suburban stash houses, a few cooperative bar owners, and a leader with 2 decades of experience dodging prosecution, and the system runs. Ross's geographic instincts mirrored that bigger picture. He bought a home in Stone Mountain, well east of the city center. He kept the bar somewhere inside the Atlanta area. He used a relative's house as a stash point and ran couriers down through College Park to the south. He pulled distribution networks back east toward Athens. Each piece of the geography served a function. Each piece kept the heat off any single property. What stitched the geography together was constant communication, and that is where the CJNG-linked side of the operation eventually buried him. Investigators captured a snapshot of the supply chain at full operational tempo by pulling text messages directly off Ross's seized iPhone. The 22-day window in 2020 was preserved in his own messages. 112 kilograms in, $2.5 million out, all time-stamped, all attributed, all sitting on his personal device. Ross was, by every measure, careful in his physical movements. He kept his name off paperwork. He compartmentalized roles. He used family for storage. But the same phone he was using to coordinate with his Mexican supplier was, in essence, also generating the prosecution's exhibit list. Once federal investigators got hold of it, the door was closed. The Mexico City meeting in August 2019 represented the high watermark of his ambition. The man who had spent years building from a county-level operation up to a multi-state network had now sat across from cartel leadership and negotiated a 200 kilogram per month resupply. From the perspective of his Mexican counterparties, Ross was the local face of an Atlanta pipeline they trusted enough to expand. From the perspective of U.S. investigators, he was now formally connected by his own admissions to a foreign drug trafficking organization that the State Department would later move into the terrorist designation column. U.S. Attorney Peter D. Leary later summarized the entire arc by saying Ross had directed enormous amounts of deadly drugs into Georgia from Mexico for many years, harming Georgia communities in exchange for a lavish lifestyle. The Mexico City meeting was the international layer of that arc, the moment the supply chain crystallized into a documented relationship between a Stone Mountain man and a cartel-connected boss. The supplier and the boss in Mexico City were not the only people Ross needed to keep happy, though. Once a 200 kilogram monthly tranche of cocaine landed in Atlanta, somebody had to break it down and push it through the local market. That part of the operation lived in Georgia neighborhoods, not Mexican cities, and it ran through a tight roster of trusted men whose names eventually filled the federal indictment, the distribution network, and the Murder Mountain marijuana. Once the Mexican side delivered, the cocaine had to disappear into Georgia. That meant breaking down massive bricks into mid-level loads, moving them through stash houses, and pushing them out to dealers spread across the middle district of Georgia. The men who did that work for Ross were the ground floor of his organization, and most of them were named in the same federal indictment that would eventually bury him. Co-defendants Lonnie Bennett, 44, of Atlanta, and Brandon Payne, 30, of Atlanta, sold cocaine supplied by Ross out of their stash house on Pittman Road in College Park, Georgia. College Park sits on the south side of the Atlanta metro, close to the airport, with quick access to the interstates. The Pittman Road location was nothing on the outside, just another house on a residential block, but inside it operated as a mid-level distribution hub. Bennett and Payne handled the day-to-day, brokering supply to the next tier of customers and keeping the inventory cycling. The most documented of those customers was a man out of Athens named Michael Darden, known on the street as T-Mike. Darden, 43, made over 20 trips from Athens to the Pittman Road stash house to purchase cocaine that he later sold throughout the middle district of Georgia. 20-plus runs, each run a logged trip on a federal investigative timeline. Each delivery feeding a separate downstream network around Athens, a college town built around the University of Georgia, with a steady customer base of students, residents, and surrounding county dealers. The image that takes shape from those trips is uncomfortable in a different way than the Mexico City meeting. Mexico City was the international layer. The Athens trips were the local layer. Cartel-sourced cocaine, freshly moved up from Texas, sat in a College Park stash house for a few hours or a few days, and then climbed into a vehicle for the drive to Athens, where it would be cut, broken down further, and sold across communities that had no idea their local supply chain ran straight back to a CJNG-linked source. Athens Clark County Police Chief Jerry Salters described the impact in plain language at sentencing, saying the volume of dangerous drugs and the firearms and acts of violence had impacted Athens area communities beyond comprehension. That impact was not abstract. Every kilogram broken down at Pittman Road eventually landed in human consequences. Overdoses, addictions, violence among street-level dealers fighting for territory, families torn apart by criminal records and incarceration. The Pittman Road house was the choke point where Mexico City money met inner-city consumer demand. Every transaction at that house was a translation between layers of the global narcotics economy. Inside the federal case, a federal grand jury in Macon returned a 15-defendant indictment in September 2021, case number 3.21 CR 39, naming Albert Ross and 11 co-defendants including Bennett, Payne, Darden, Battle, and 7 others: Richard Cornelius, Eric Morgan, Bernard Wilcox, Miller Sutton, Hafez Abdullahi, Danny Sims, and Corey Mitchell, 12 named men, a small army of distributors, runners, couriers, and stash house operators, each one carrying a specific role in the larger machine. Some were mid-level distributors. Some were specialized in transport. Some had been brought in for specific tasks and stayed. While the cocaine pipeline was the spine of the organization, it was not the whole skeleton. Running alongside it, on a parallel track, was a marijuana operation that drew product from one of the most notorious cannabis production zones in North America. Ross tasked co-conspirators with transporting and distributing large shipments of marijuana from Murder Mountain, a region in Humboldt County, California, known for its marijuana production. Murder Mountain is a real place, a stretch of remote off-grid territory in the Emerald Triangle of Northern California, where outlaw cannabis growers have operated for generations. The name attached itself to the region during a cluster of disappearances and unsolved killings tied to the underground weed economy. Even after California legalized cannabis, the off-the-books grow scene in Humboldt continued to function in a parallel untaxed economy with its own rules of violence and its own internal politics. Ross plugged into that economy as a major buyer. As one example documented in court filings, 24,000 pounds of marijuana was shipped over 8 trips from California to Georgia, as directed by Ross. Significant amounts were distributed to dealers in the Middle District of Georgia, including co-defendant Reginald Battle Sr., 49, of Statham, Georgia. 8 trips and 24,000 pounds, that is 12 tons of cannabis crossing the country, and coordinated freight runs to feed a Georgia distribution chain that already had its hooks in the cocaine market. Battle later pleaded guilty in October 2023 to conspiracy charges in the same indictment, one of several co-defendants whose plea deals filled the docket in the months ahead of Ross's own. The marijuana side of the operation was not a sideline. It was a strategic complement to the cocaine work. Cannabis carried lower legal exposure if intercepted, lower margins per kilogram, but vastly higher mass, meaning the marijuana pipeline absorbed truck capacity and helped diversify the portfolio. If federal interdiction shut down a cocaine route for a few weeks, the marijuana revenue could keep the lights on. If law enforcement focused on the cannabis side, the cocaine pipeline could keep generating cash. It was the same diversification logic Ross applied with his 2 parallel cocaine suppliers. On top of the stash houses and the distribution network sat the Atlanta area bar that Ross owned. Inside that bar, agents seized over $600,000 in drug proceeds during the takedown. The bar's specific name was not disclosed in any official press release. What we know about it from filings is functional. It was a private club-style operation, owned by Ross, presented to outsiders as legitimate hospitality and used in practice as a holding tank for cash. A bar was an inspired choice for that purpose. Bars handle large volumes of cash by their nature, with legitimate reasons for daily deposits, payroll, vendor invoices, and inventory that can be inflated or doctored to disguise irregular cash flows. Whether the bar was actively laundering proceeds or simply being used as a storage point that mimicked legitimate operations is something the public filings stopped short of detailing. What is documented is the result, $600,000 in drug money sitting inside the building when agents arrived. The whole network, the stash houses, the runners, the bar, the suburban warehouse, the marijuana pipeline, fed into a single distribution map. Atlanta sat in the middle as the cash collection and laundering point that fed money back to Mexico, with a Texas to Atlanta cocaine corridor on one axis and a California to Atlanta marijuana corridor on another. Ross was building the kind of operation that capitalized on Atlanta's status as a transshipment hub for Mexican cartels. College Park to Athens, Stone Mountain to a bar somewhere on Atlanta's east side, the elderly relative's home as the ultimate vault. T-Mike running back and forth more than 20 times, Bennett and Payne working the Pittman road counter, Battle moving Murder Mountain marijuana out to Statham, 8 other men named in the indictment doing whatever specialized roles their pieces of the machine required. What stitched the network together at the operational level was discipline. Ross kept the inner roles compartmentalized so that no single arrest would expose the whole organization. The man who ordered shipments was not the man who drove the loads. The men who counted the cash were not the men who picked up the next delivery. The bar owner was the man at the top, but the bar staff most likely had no idea what was happening with the duffel bags coming in and out. The discipline worked for years. It worked all the way up until federal investigators reached a level of access where they no longer needed to crack the inner ring from the outside. They were already inside it. While Ross was negotiating in Mexico City and his Pittman road network was moving cocaine to Athens, federal agents were quietly building one of the longest interagency drug investigations the Middle District of Georgia had ever run. And the moments that turned that investigation from background work to overwhelming evidence had already started to land. in a Georgia traffic stop, on a tarmac in California, and in a phone call where Ross asked someone to commit murder. The I-20 seizure, the murder order, and the federal investigation. The first crack in the operation came on a stretch of Interstate 20 in March 2018, a year and a half before Ross would board his flight to Mexico City. The interstate is a ribbon of asphalt that runs east-west across the southern United States, and along that ribbon, Ross's organization had been pushing cocaine from Texas into Georgia for years. In March 2018, Ross and his business partner purchased approximately $4 million of cocaine for transport from Texas to Georgia. A tractor trailer was stopped on I-20 by a Georgia state trooper who found 152 kilograms of cocaine in a false wall inside the transport truck. 152 kilograms, $4 million in cocaine, intercepted in a single highway stop. The false wall in the trailer was not cheap craftsmanship. Concealment compartments at that level, sealed, rebuilt, painted, weighted, and undetectable to a casual inspection, are built by specialized fabricators who charge tens of thousands of dollars per truck. The investment in that hidden compartment alone tells you how confident Ross's organization was in its ability to move bulk cocaine on the interstate without anyone looking too closely. A Georgia state trooper changed that calculation in a single afternoon. The truck was pulled over, the wall was found, the cocaine was seized, and the load Ross had spent millions to acquire was gone in a matter of minutes. What Ross did next is the part of the case that distinguishes him from a routine large-scale trafficker. Following the cocaine seizure, Ross asked another co-conspirator to kill the person responsible for overseeing the intercepted drug load. The co-conspirator refused the murder order. Read that twice. Ross ordered a killing. The man assigned to carry it out said no. Ross admitted to the order in his own guilty plea, read aloud in open court, with the entire stipulation of facts on the record. That single decision shows how Ross managed his organization. The seizure cost him several $1 million in product. His response to that loss was an attempt to physically eliminate the man he held responsible. The order was given. Whoever it was given to looked at it and refused. The court record never names the person who refused. Their motive is unknown. Conscience, fear, prior cooperation with law enforcement, or simply self-preservation. Any of those could explain the refusal. What the public files preserve is the sequence. The load was seized, the order was issued, and the order was rejected. That fact alone reshapes how the rest of the investigation should be understood, because every subsequent move by federal agents was happening in a context where Ross had already demonstrated a willingness to kill over a logistics failure. That episode was the first major loss the public can document, but the second one was already on its way. 9 months later, in December 2018, Ross's air courier system became the next target. DEA agents received information from a confidential source that Ross was moving a large amount of cash from illegal drug sales from Atlanta to California using private aircraft. Agents observed men leave Ross's Boulder Crest Road stash house and board a plane at Peachtree DeKalb Airport with 4 suitcases and 2 backpacks. DEA and FBI agents in California were waiting and seized more than $2 million in drug proceeds from the luggage. The detail in that paragraph is the entire tradecraft of his organization compressed into a single operation. A stash house on Boulder Crest Road in Atlanta. A short drive to Peachtree DeKalb Airport, a regional airfield where small private planes can take off without the scrutiny of a major commercial terminal. 4 suitcases and 2 backpacks of cash. A flight west toward California, where the money would have continued its journey toward the Mexican border. An organization with the resources to charter or arrange aircraft for cash transport, the discipline to keep the cash out of banking systems, and the geographic reach to launder receipts on a coast-to-coast scale. What Ross did not know was that the men leaving the Boulder Crest Roadhouse had been under surveillance from the moment they walked out the door. The plane was tracked. California-based DEA and FBI agents were waiting on the other end of the flight. By the time the wheels touched down, the suitcases were never going to make it to whatever destination Ross had imagined. $2 million in drug proceeds came off the plane and into evidence. 2 enormous losses in a calendar year. $4 million in cocaine seized in March, $2 million in cash seized in December. A normal organization might have folded under that kind of pressure. Ross did not. He rebuilt, he tightened, he kept the pipeline running, and he flew to Mexico City 8 months later to negotiate an additional 200 kilograms per month with his CJNG-linked supplier. The reason he was able to keep going was that the federal investigation was still in its earlier phases. The full machinery had not yet closed around him. The FBI Athens resident agency had initiated a long-term investigation focused primarily on Ross's cocaine distribution activities. The phrase long-term is doing important work in that sentence. This was not a fast-moving sting. This was a multi-year build-out of evidence. Through the use of many investigative techniques including wiretaps, physical surveillance, vehicle trackers, and confidential informants, agents identified a network of individuals associated with Ross's organization. Each of those techniques is a discrete legal and operational lift. Wiretaps require warrants and continuous monitoring. Physical surveillance requires teams of agents working rotations. Vehicle trackers require court approvals and discrete installation. Confidential informants require recruitment, validation, and protection. The list of agencies involved illustrates the scale. The case was investigated by FBI Atlanta's Athens resident agency, Middle Georgia Safe Streets Gang Task Force, the DEA, the Athens Clark County Police Department, the Northeast Georgia Regional Drug Task Force, the GBI, the Georgia Department of Community Supervision, the Georgia Department of Corrections, the Georgia Department of Revenue, the Georgia State Patrol, several county sheriff's offices including Forsyth, Fulton, Oconee, Oglethorpe, and Rockdale, the Atlanta Police Department, the Brookhaven Police Department, the Cobb County Police Department, the DeKalb County Police Department, the Gwinnett County Police Department, the Henry County Police Department, the Marietta Police Department, and the South Fulton Police Department. That list is the architecture of a multi-jurisdictional takedown, more than 20 agencies coordinating across federal, state, county, and municipal levels. That kind of coordination is not assembled around a small operation. The fact that the FBI built that bench at all is a quiet measure of how much weight the Bureau already placed on Ross's network. The case was prosecuted as part of an organized crime drug enforcement task force operation, the federal program that identifies, disrupts, and dismantles the highest level criminal organizations that threaten the United States. OCDETF cases are not initiated for street dealers. They are initiated for command level traffickers running organizations of national or international consequence. Ross's case sat squarely in that category. The investigation also generated information sources from inside the organization. The architecture of confidential informants paired with wiretaps and surveillance suggests that someone inside Ross's circle had been feeding data to federal investigators for an extended period. The 2018 December airport interception was triggered specifically by information from a confidential source about cash movement on private aircraft. That tip alone implies a level of insider access that Ross likely never identified during the years his pipeline was still running. By the spring of 2020, when Ross's iPhone was generating the 22-day text record that would later anchor the prosecution, federal agents had enough surveillance, enough informant material, and enough physical evidence to begin closing the case. The agents on the ground at this stage were no longer collecting, they were finalizing. They knew the routes, they knew the players, they had Ross's voice on tape, his vehicles on trackers, his money in the closet, and his text messages on a phone that would, one day, sit in a federal evidence locker. The arrest itself was timed to that finalization. By September 2021, the investigation was ready to move from observation to action, and on September 23rd of that year, the agents finally walked up to the front door of Albert Ross's Stone Mountain home. The arrest, the plea, and 2 life sentences. The morning of September 23rd, 2021, federal agents made entry at Ross's home in Stone Mountain. The front door of the suburban property where Ross had lived for years opened onto the kind of search that had been planned in detail for months. Inside Ross's bedroom closet, agents found more than $300,000 in cash wrapped in tinfoil and vacuum sealed in black trash bags. Tinfoil wrapped bricks of cash, sealed inside trash bags, sitting in the closet of a suburban Georgia home. The optics of that search are difficult to fully process. The same man who had flown to Mexico City to negotiate with cartel leadership, who had a Texas to Georgia cocaine pipeline humming at full speed, who had a Murder Mountain to Atlanta marijuana corridor running underneath the cocaine line, was keeping his own personal liquid reserves in the closet of a modest residential home. While the Stone Mountain search was underway, agents simultaneously hit the bar Ross owned in the Atlanta area. Inside that bar, agents seized more than $600,000 in drug proceeds. The same operation that had laundered hundreds of thousands of dollars through ordinary-looking transactions was also, in the end, storing 6 figures of straight cash on the premises. As part of the entire investigation, law enforcement seized $3,164,210 in cash, 73 firearms, 165.22 kilograms of cocaine, 1.32 kilograms of fentanyl, and 11.25 ounces of heroin. 11.25 ounces of heroin, 1.39 kilograms of crack cocaine, 12.57 pounds of crystal methamphetamine, 25.35 pounds of marijuana, and 198 dosage units of controlled pharmaceuticals. Read that inventory slowly. $3 million in cash, 73 guns, over 165 kilograms of cocaine still in the pipeline at the time of the takedown. Fentanyl, heroin, crack, methamphetamine, marijuana, and prescription pills. Each line on that list represents a supply chain, a customer base, and communities that absorb the consequences. Each of those communities was, on the day of the takedown, suddenly cut off from one of its major supply nodes. The arrest of Ross did not end the case. In the days and weeks that followed, the federal indictment unfolded across the rest of his organization. In September 2021, a federal grand jury in Macon returned the 15-defendant indictment, case number 3.21 CR 39, charging Ross and 11 co-defendants with cocaine trafficking conspiracies. The names that followed Ross's were the names that had been moving his product for years: Bennett, Payne, Darden, Battle, Cornelius, Morgan, Wilcox, Sutton, Abdullahi, Sims, and Mitchell. Over the next 2 years, the co-defendants began entering pleas. Reginald Battle Sr., the Statham, Georgia distributor tied to the Murder Mountain marijuana pipeline, pleaded guilty to cocaine conspiracy charges in October 2023. 2 months later, in December 2023, to Michael Darden, the Athens-based T-Mike, who had made over 20 trips between Athens and the Pittman Road stash house, pleaded guilty to cocaine conspiracy counts in the same case. Each plea further cemented the federal narrative. By the time Ross's own plea hearing arrived, the supporting witnesses, the cooperating defendants, the seized phone, the tracked vehicles, the wiretaps, the surveillance footage, and the decades of records had been compiled into one of the most complete drug trafficking files ever produced out of the Middle District of Georgia. On January 22, 2024, Albert Big Ross pleaded guilty in federal court to 2 conspiracy charges: 1 count of conspiracy to possess with intent to distribute cocaine, and 1 count of conspiracy to possess with intent to distribute marijuana. The plea was entered before U.S. District Judge Tillman Tripp Self-3. In open court, the stipulation of facts was read aloud. Ross admitted he had been the leader of the organization. He admitted to importing approximately 2,000 kilograms of cocaine from Mexico into the United States. He admitted to the Mexico City meeting. He admitted to ordering the murder over the I-20 seizure. He admitted to the elderly family member's home as a stash point. The full architecture of his career was, at last, on the public record under his own name. 5 months later, Judge Self pronounced sentence. On June 10, 2024, Ross was sentenced to 2 life sentences in prison, the statutory maximum, with 5 years of supervised release and a $1 million fine. There is no parole in the federal system. 2 life sentences, a statutory maximum on each count, a $1 million fine, a supervised release term that, in practical terms, will never apply, because Ross will spend the rest of his life inside federal custody. The sentence formally closed Ross's case, but it also closed something larger. The case represented one of the most coordinated drug trafficking takedowns in the Middle District of Georgia. The architecture of the response, the OCDETF designation, the more than 20 agencies coordinating across jurisdictions, the multi-year wiretap and surveillance build-out, and the ultimate 2 life sentences indicated that the federal system treated Ross's network as a national tier threat. DEA Atlanta Special Agent in Charge Robert J. Murphy underscored the same message at the sentencing announcement, framing the operation as a demonstration of the agency's commitment to attacking drug dealers responsible for devastation in U.S. communities. Athens Clark County Police Chief Jerry Salters added that the volume of dangerous drugs, firearms, and acts of violence in cases like Ross's affect Georgia communities at a scale beyond ordinary comprehension. The unified message from the agencies involved was straightforward. This had been one of the longest, most coordinated, and most consequential drug takedowns in the region's recent history. 2 prosecutors from the U.S. Attorney's Office handled the case from the government side. Assistant U.S. Attorneys Mike Morrison and Tamara Jarrett prosecuted Ross for the government, tying together the federal evidence into the courtroom presentation that ultimately produced the guilty plea and the 2 life terms. What the case ultimately did not produce, however, is just as worth attention as what it did. The elderly family member whose home held 1,300 kilograms of cocaine, who had previously been shot picking up drug proceeds for Ross, was never publicly named. No charges were filed against that person. No press release acknowledged their role beyond the bare phrase, elderly family member. Whatever happened in that house, the months of cocaine moving in and out, the financial arrangements, the recovery from a gunshot wound suffered in service to Ross's organization, never became part of the public narrative. The same pattern surrounded Ross's bar. Its name never appeared in any public document. The operations of the bar, the staff, the customers, all of that remained off the federal record. Whatever those people knew, whatever they saw, whatever role they played in the cash side of the operation did not surface in any indictment. That is part of what large-scale drug cases produce. The leader and the named co-defendants get the headlines. The infrastructure people, the relatives, the bartenders, the neighbors, the property owners, the drivers who never got named, fall back into ordinary life. Sometimes that is by design from the prosecution side. Sometimes it is the result of insufficient evidence to bring charges. Sometimes it is a function of where the lines are drawn in a sprawling multi-state investigation. Ross's network also touched a customer base whose names never appeared in any filing. The college students and area residents in Athens who bought from local dealers tied to the Pittman Road pipeline. The downstream users in towns across Middle Georgia who bought from Battle's network. The people who lost loved ones to overdoses tied to the fentanyl that was seized on the day of the arrest. Those communities absorbed the consequences of Ross's operation long after the cocaine moved through the elderly family member's home. The closing summary of the case, from the perspective of the agents who built it, was delivered by FBI Atlanta on the day of sentencing. That was Robert Gibbs of the FBI's Macon office, addressing the volume of drugs Ross had pushed into Middle Georgia and the years of work that had gone into stopping him. The statement was short and the tone was final. Ross had pushed cartel-sourced cocaine into Georgia communities for years. The federal system had matched that timeline with a multi-year investigation. The result was 2 life sentences, no parole, and a closed file. The man from Stone Mountain, who had built one of the most coordinated drug pipelines the region had ever seen, ended his career with $300,000 of his own money sitting in tinfoil-wrapped trash bags inside a closet. His Mexico City counterparties protected by the international border, his bar quietly continuing to exist in some form, his elderly family member never named in any indictment, and his own mugshot updated for what will be the last time. The quiet Georgia home that anchored the case. The suburban relative's house that held 3,300 kilograms of cocaine and a value media reports later put around $4.5 million never made the press release as more than a phrase. 3 words on a court filing: elderly family member's home. That was the warehouse. That was the foundation. That was the address where one of the largest cartel-connected cocaine pipelines in Georgia history quietly stored its inventory until federal agents knocked on Ross's door in Stone Mountain on the morning of September 23, 2021, and finally pulled the entire structure down.